Before everything fell apart, Mark Grayson was a relentless businessman, recognized for his sharp mind and powerful presence in the financial world. He built his career by maneuvering through the currency markets for elite clients, including influential hedge funds. Mark's success gave him wealth and authority, but it also bred enemies, laying the groundwork for a betrayal that would change his life forever. Mark believed he had full control over both his professional and personal life. On the surface, his marriage to Emily appeared perfect, but beneath this facade of success, something dark was simmering, a betrayal that would soon destroy him. What happened next was far from a random robbery. It was a meticulously planned conspiracy by people he thought he could trust. One sweltering morning in August, Mark's life took a terrifying turn. After what seemed like a typical start to the day, he entered the elevator in his office building, joined by two strangers. At first, they engaged in casual chit-chat, but soon their demeanor shifted into something far more sinister. Without warning, Mark was attacked, and his last thought before blacking out was the chilling realization. He had been set up, but it was already too late. "Mr. Smith?" A voice called out, louder now, as Mark felt a sharp pain in his hand, his index finger being crushed. He couldn't breathe, the weight on his chest pressing him down. "You're in the hospital, Mark." The voice grew clearer. "We need to run a few tests, and then you can rest." "Hospital? Rest?" The words felt foreign to him. "Open your eyes, Mark." He struggled, managing only a brief glimpse of light before it became too much. "Good, try again." A blinding light stabbed at his senses, then faded. "Can you squeeze my hands?" He felt pressure on his hand and tried to respond. "Great. Now wiggle your toes." He felt a sharp scrape on his foot, causing him to flinch. "Excellent. You're improving, Mr. Smith." "Rest again." Darkness returned. When Mark regained consciousness, it felt as though he was struggling to rise from under a heavy weight. He could feel cool air from a fan and his legs moving as if he were walking, except he wasn't. A faint beep sounded behind him, followed by brief buzzing to his right, and then a persistent chime. He tried to turn his head, which immediately triggered an alarm near his feet. "What's happening?" he wondered, confused. "Hey there, buddy," a friendly voice said. He heard a chair scrape across the floor and then felt a hand on his shoulder. "You're waking up after being in a coma for quite a while." Something tugged at his arm, and the beeping stopped. "I'm Brian, one of the nurses looking after you." Mark tried to speak, but no sound came out. "You can't talk yet because there's a tracheostomy tube in your neck to help you breathe. You're on a ventilator, but we're planning to remove it soon." He felt a damp cloth wipe his right eye and cheek. "What's wrong with my face?" he thought. He couldn't feel the left side. "Try to open your eyes, Mark." "I'll dim the lights," Brian said. "Give it a try now." Mark blinked, and light slowly came into focus, blurry but there. The cloth wiped his eye again, and things became a bit clearer. "Clearing some ointment from your eye after the drops," Brian explained, wiping again. Gradually, the room came into focus, and Mark could see a figure standing over him. "Blink a few times, it'll help," Brian suggested. The figure became clearer, a man with long brown hair, a short beard, and a stethoscope hanging over dark blue scrubs. "Welcome back, buddy." "It's been a long journey," Brian said, smiling while holding a small red flashlight. "I'm going to check your eye, okay?" The light flashed but wasn't unbearable. "Great, now for the next step. Squeeze my fingers." Mark squeezed. "Good. Now wiggle your toes." He did. "All right," Brian said, tapping something on his tablet. "We've been calling you MG since we didn't know your full name, but you seem to be responding to it. Is your name Mark?" "Nod or shake your head." Mark nodded. 2 points for the good guys," Brian laughed, making another note on the tablet. "You're in the ICU at Green Valley Medical Center. You've been here for over a month. Today is Tuesday, September 28th, 2021. Mark's foggy brain struggled to process the information. "If you look over there by the door, you'll see a whiteboard with the date and the names of your doctor and the staff working with you," Brian pointed out. "I'm Brian. Dr. Nelson is the intensivist. Maya is your medical assistant, and Ray is your respiratory therapist." Brian returned to the bedside. "It's 2 a.m., middle of the night shift." He held up a small plastic tube. This is a suction catheter. I'm going to clear out the spit from the back of your mouth. Mark heard the slurping sound, but could barely feel anything. Other things you should know, Brian continued. You have a tracheostomy tube, an NG tube in your stomach, and a catheter. So, if it feels like you have to pee, don't worry. Mark did, in fact, have that sensation. Your urine is going into a bag by your bed, Brian reassured him. And we've tied your wrists with soft restraints to stop you from pulling out anything while you're still recovering. Once you're off the ventilator, we can remove them if you promise not to mess with anything. Brian's voice softened. Are you in pain? Squeeze my hand if you are. Mark shrugged, unsure. Okay, we want you comfortable, but not too out of it, Brian said, pointing at a row of medical instruments. You're on a lot of medication, but we'll ease off when it's possible. None of it made sense to Mark, so he just stared at the ceiling, slowly drifting off. His sleep was haunted by horrifying visions of pain, betrayal, and confusion, images that melted away as quickly as they appeared. Mark woke, gasping for air, alarms blaring on his left side. His left arm was bandaged, and as he coughed, he felt sharp pain in his throat and chest. Easy now, a gentle female voice said. A blonde woman appeared in his line of sight. I'm Sarah, your respiratory therapist. We're weaning you off the ventilator. Are you in pain? Mark nodded, the sharp ache in his face becoming more noticeable. His legs moved slightly, guided by mechanical attachments making them walk in place. I'll get your nurse, Sarah said, before leaving. A while later, Mark woke more alert. The ventilator had been replaced by a misting blue hose, and his bed had been raised. His legs were now free of the robotic devices, and his mind felt clearer. Morning had arrived, and the room buzzed with activity as doctors, nurses, and therapists moved in and out. Mark was gradually making progress, and as the days went by, he was moved to a different part of the hospital for various scans. The nurses seemed pleased with how well he was doing, though most of the medical jargon made little sense to him. They assisted him in sitting in a chair, and even managed to help him stand for a few moments. The doctors reassured him that, despite having sustained a traumatic brain injury, TBI, his brain was still intact. One of the doctors even mentioned how his fractured skull had actually prevented further damage by relieving some of the pressure from brain swelling. For Mark, though, the real highlight was when they finally removed the catheter, allowing him to urinate on his own. The small victories, he thought with a hint of satisfaction. A few days later, Mark awoke to find several unfamiliar individuals in dark suits surrounding his bed. They exuded an aura that immediately made him uneasy. Mr. Smith, called the tallest man among them, a man with wild red hair and a gray-streaked goatee. His dark eyes were piercing. I'm Dr. Everett J. Malcolm, he continued without offering a handshake. Mark swallowed nervously and nodded. Though the tracheostomy tube was still in his throat, it had been replaced with a smaller one that would eventually allow him to speak using a valve attachment. Unfortunately, he didn't have that piece on at the moment, so he remained silent. I represent a medical research coalition, Dr. Malcolm began, his tone brisk and dismissive, involved in cutting-edge research and advanced biomedical projects. He gave a brief, indifferent shrug. We've been monitoring your progress for the past 7 weeks, and we've had a hand in some of your treatments. Now, we need to discuss your rehabilitation and some other options you may want to consider. Mark's shaky hand reached for the dry erase board that had been left on the small table next to his bed. Slowly, he wrote, "What is this about?" Dr. Malcolm read the board and raised an eyebrow. "It's best if we start by going over your current condition and the events that brought you here before moving on to your options." He gestured toward a woman with short-cropped hair and a stern expression who stepped forward holding a tablet. "Mr. Smith," she began, her voice clipped. "You've been in this hospital for almost 2 months now." She paused as Mark made an attempt to write. "We don't have precise details on how you were injured. You were found lying in an alley, and most thought you were already dead." She held up a series of gruesome photos from his initial arrival at the ER. Mark turned his head, struggling to make sense of the blurred images. "The paramedics thought you were a lost cause," she continued, "but discovered, barely, that you still had a pulse." She flipped the tablet, showing the date. "That was on August 14th. Mark blinked, trying to process this. You had no identification, and your fingerprints matched no records. No distinct marks, tattoos, scars, or past surgeries to help identify you. Even facial recognition yielded no results. Mark tried to write something, but she stopped him. "It doesn't really matter who you were, Mr. Smith," she said sharply. "As far as anyone else is concerned, you're officially dead." She held up a death certificate. "In fact, you technically died 3 times during the first week you were here." After a moment's pause, she added, "You should also know that you've accumulated quite a hefty medical bill." She turned the tablet around again, revealing a balance of over $1 million. "And that doesn't even account for our additional, life-saving interventions," Dr. Malcolm interjected. "You haven't even begun rehabilitation, and already your debt is significant," he added with a humorless smile. Mark couldn't help but think, "Great bedside manner." Dr. Malcolm cleared his throat, continuing, "Despite all of this, your situation does present a few unique opportunities that we believe you should consider before planning your next steps." A man of East Asian descent stepped forward, giving Mark a respectful bow from the foot of his bed. "Mr. Smith," he began, "I'll be direct. You face an extensive recovery process before you can even hope to lead a normal life again. Right now, you are still suffering from a major head injury, several broken bones that are still mending, and a spinal cord injury that has caused at least partial paralysis of your left side. Additionally, you've lost vision in your left eye entirely, along with significant damage to the surrounding bone and tissue. To add to this," he paused, his expression serious, "your reproductive organs were badly damaged. Whether the remaining one is even functional remains uncertain." Mark's mind reeled, struggling to absorb the wave of terrible information. Nobody had given him a complete overview of his injuries until this moment, and the reality felt like a crushing weight on his chest. He grimaced, trying to conjure any concrete memory that might explain how he had ended up here, but all that surfaced were vague, nightmarish fragments. Dr. Malcolm's cough broke into Mark's muddled thoughts, pulling him back. "In a way, Mr. Smith," Dr. Malcolm said, almost nonchalantly, "you owe your presence here today to our timely interventions." He paused to remove his gold-rimmed glasses, fogged them with his breath, and carefully wiped them with a silk cloth. "But let's talk about the 2 options ahead of you." He put his glasses back on and gave Mark a cool, businesslike look. "The first is to continue with the current care plan. This involves transferring you to a rehabilitation facility specializing in helping patients regain strength, mobility, and some semblance of independence. However, given your lack of insurance or any form of substantial payment, your care would be, well, less than optimal." Mark could feel his anxiety begin to spike once more. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air oppressive, surrounded by these cold, emotionless people in their suits. He wanted nothing more than to escape. Dr. Malcolm's voice cut through the tension again. "But there is another option." He stepped aside, allowing a young man with nervous eyes and a tablet to step forward to the side of Mark's bed. "Mr. Smith," the young man stammered slightly, "before we move forward, we need you to sign a few documents." He handed Mark the tablet, and Mark's eyes scanned the dense, small print on the screen. "You can read it all if you want," the young man added with a weak smile. "But by the time you finish, well, I think we'd all be retired." He attempted a joke, though it fell flat, the silence thick in the room. "The first signature authorizes us to continue treatment, grants us access to your records, and allows us to act on your behalf regarding legal and medical decisions during this immediate period." Mark hesitated, his thumb hovering over the yellow signature button. He glanced up, looking at the expressions of the people gathered around his bed, serious and expectant. Mark scrawled his name on the screen using his finger. "Great," the young man said, visibly relieved as he swiped to another section on the tablet. "The next signatures are pretty crucial," he continued. "First, by agreeing to this treatment, you acknowledge the risks involved and agree not to hold us accountable for any complications or adverse outcomes." He gave Mark a wink. "Don't worry, Mr. Smith. You're in much better hands than you'd be in a standard rehab facility." He scrolled to the final screen and added, "Lastly, this is our non-disclosure agreement. Signing means you agree not to talk about any aspect of your treatment from this point on." Mark stared at the tablet for a moment, then set it down on the side table. Slowly, he picked up his dry erase board and wrote, "What do I get in return?" Dr. Malcolm nodded approvingly, a slight smile touching his lips. "Fair question, Mr. Smith. While I can't guarantee you'll ever return to a full recovery, I can assure you that with our cutting-edge technology, you'll get the best outcome possible," he said, crossing his arms. "In fact, with our experimental methods, you may even surpass your former limits. But, of course," he added with a shrug, "nothing is guaranteed." Mark glanced at the tablet, still unsure. Another man from the group softly cleared his throat, drawing a frown from Dr. Malcolm. "If I may, sir," the man said quietly, stepping forward. He addressed Mark directly. "Mr. Smith, I should also mention that by agreeing to join our experimental program, all your current financial debts will be forgiven, regardless of the outcome." Mark looked back at Dr. Malcolm, who gave him a subtle nod. Taking a deep breath, Mark picked up the tablet once more and scribbled his signature again before handing it back. "Excellent, Mr. Smith," Dr. Malcolm said, an unmistakable gleam in his eye. "Your new program will commence shortly. You'll be transferred to our private facility later this evening." With that, the group of strangers left the room just as quickly and quietly as they had arrived. Mark leaned back against the pillow, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of everything that had just happened. By the time they transferred him to the new facility, it all felt like a blur, a mix of pain, confusion, and exhaustion. A petite doctor with shoulder-length brown hair and large glasses greeted him at the new facility. "I'm Dr. Janice Willoughby," she introduced herself, her voice clinical and detached. "When you first came to our attention," she said, "your chances of survival were less than 5%. Standing about 5 feet 6 inches, her rail-thin frame seemed almost hidden beneath scrubs and an oversized lab coat. Her tone was calm, like she was delivering a lecture. "We have been monitoring your progress closely," she continued, "and our team has played a significant role in your recovery thus far. The trauma to your brain was so severe that if your skull hadn't been fractured, allowing it to expand, you would not have survived. Thankfully, the fractures allowed your brain to swell beyond its usual confines, which gave you a fighting chance." Dr. Willoughby gestured to some medical images on a nearby screen. MRIs, CT scans, and more. To Mark, the scans were an incomprehensible blur of grays and whites. "Your injuries were substantial," she went on. "You sustained a Lefort 3 fracture to your facial structure, which caused extensive damage to your left orbital socket, leading to permanent optic nerve damage in that eye." She paused. "Your right testicle was also lost due to severe torsion, and you suffered multiple contusions to the lungs, along with fractures in both legs, arms, several ribs, and your left collarbone." Mark's stomach churned as she listed each injury. It was as if every bone and organ she named caused a fresh pang of pain to flare through his body. "We've reconstructed most of the facial bones," she said, "though there is still a considerable amount of swelling and scarring." She held up a small silver bag. "To control the swelling and pressure, we administered mannitol to draw fluid away from the brain. However, in your case, its effect was limited because of the extensive injuries you had sustained elsewhere." She lifted the bag slightly. "This, along with various other treatments, is what ultimately saved your life." Mark stared at the bag, his thoughts a jumble of confusion and fear. His body ached with a dull, ever-present throb, and the doctor's words seemed surreal. Dr. Willoughby continued speaking, her expression unmoved as she spoke about the advanced technologies that had been part of his recovery. "We have also introduced a synthetic blood plasma replacement into your system," she said, "which contains millions of nanobots capable of responding to telemetry commands. These nanobots regulate your blood flow, prevent clotting, and help repair damaged tissues. They will remain in your system indefinitely." Mark could barely process what she was saying. It all sounded like something out of a science fiction story, a far cry from the reality he had known. She paused, her intense gaze locking onto his. "Tomorrow, we will begin the next phase of your recovery. We will be focusing on correcting your spinal vertebrae and addressing the nerve pathways that are causing the paralysis on your left side," she said. Mark cleared his throat, testing his voice for the first time. It came out hoarse. "How long will that take?" he managed to ask. Dr. Willoughby gave a small, indifferent shrug. It's a routine procedure, she replied. You should be back in your room by noon, and we'll have a clearer understanding of the extent of your deficits shortly afterward. Sounds peachy, Doc, Mark muttered, trying to muster a weak smile. The doctor didn't respond to his attempt at humor. She simply nodded and left the room. 2 months earlier, on Saturday, August 14th, just after 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, Mark Grayson hurried home. He stepped off the crowded bus and made his way briskly down the half-block to his apartment building, a towering 50-story high-rise. The doorman gave him a quick nod as Mark rushed past, muttering under his breath about nonsense meetings. He was annoyed. Spending hours trying to keep pace with the fluctuations in the markets had been draining, especially when his partner, Emily, needed him home. Mark reached the elevator bank and pressed the button. A few moments later, 2 other men approached and stood next to him. The elevator doors slid open, and the 3 of them stepped inside together. Mark pressed the button for the 36th floor, while one of the other men pressed for the 40th. Mark frowned, recognizing that the 40th floor belonged to a hedge fund he used to do work for. You're Mark Grayson, right? A thick Jersey accent asked from behind him. Yeah, Mark replied, shrugging without bothering to turn around. Who wants to know? Our buddy Tony told us about you, said the voice. Said you're a real shark when it comes to the markets. Tony who? Mark asked, his frown deepening as he started to turn. Suddenly, a loud clicking noise echoed through the elevator, followed immediately by an explosion of pain and a flash of blinding white light. Marky, a voice called mockingly, echoing in his head like it was bouncing around in a hollow chamber. Hey, Marky boy. He was jolted back into consciousness by the sharp sting of ammonia burning through his nostrils. His head pounded, and his eyes watered as he groaned, trying to move but finding he couldn't. There he is, the same mocking voice said, smooth and dripping with derision. Mark's vision slowly cleared, and he found himself staring up at a middle-aged man with sharp, hawk-like features. He was dressed in a 3-piece suit that seemed almost out of place, his slicked-back black hair glistening under the harsh lights, his scent reeking of cheap cologne. The man grinned down at Mark, holding the smelling salts just out of reach. What? Mark's throat felt like sandpaper. Hey there, Marky. Welcome back, the man said, his voice dripping with fake cheerfulness. Who are you? Mark managed to croak as he became increasingly aware of his situation. His hands tied behind his back, his feet bound, lying there, stripped of his clothes, on an icy linoleum floor. What is this? Mark struggled against the restraints, but it was futile. The man straightened up, tossing the smelling salts aside, his smile unwavering. I'm Leonard Russo, but my friends call me Lenny. He gestured broadly around the room. And this, Marky, this is the first day of the rest of your life. However long that ends up being. Mark's head pounded as he struggled to understand what was happening. Why are you doing this to me? Bring him up, boys, Lenny commanded. The 2 men from the elevator reappeared, each grabbing one of Mark's arms, hauling him roughly to his feet. He swayed unsteadily, but they held him firmly in place. His eyes darted around, desperate to recognize his surroundings, but there was nothing familiar. His gaze landed back on Lenny, and his stomach twisted with dread. You see, Marky, it's like this, Lenny began, pacing back and forth in front of Mark. You've been working hard, manipulating the currency markets for a colleague of mine. He stopped, leaning in close, a grin spreading across his face. And you've done a fine job. He waved a device in front of Mark's face. It looked like some sort of cattle prod. But I also know, Lenny's voice turned cold, that you've been siphoning off a little of that money into your own offshore account, haven't you? Maybe to protect it from prying eyes? He smiled, watching Mark's face as the color drained away. A cold sweat broke out across Mark's forehead. No one knew about the secret transfers, no one except for him and Emily, his confidant at work. Mark swallowed hard, his mind racing. I don't know what you're talking about, he stammered, attempting to deny it. Lenny moved swiftly, his smile vanishing as he activated the taser, pressing it hard against Mark's chest. The jolt hit Mark like a lightning bolt, 50,000 volts of electricity tearing through his body, causing every muscle to seize up in agony. He screamed, his vision tunneling as the unbearable pain dragged him down into darkness. "Don't play me for a fool, Mr. Grayson." Lenny's voice was like a snarl, and Mark felt his face being roughly grabbed. His head jerked back so he had no choice but to look into Lenny's eyes. "My patience is wearing thin," Lenny hissed. "I want the account numbers, the access codes to those offshore accounts, and I want them now. The longer you hold out, the worse this is going to get for you." "Please," Mark gasped when he could finally speak again, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You don't understand." "No, wait," he cried as Lenny raised the taser again. Lenny shook his head, a sneer curling his lips. "Marky, Marky, Marky," he tooted, wagging a finger in front of Mark's face. "You know, Emily warned me about you." Mark's heart sank instantly. Emily. They must have gotten to her first. Tortured her. She was his closest ally, a partner of sorts, and they'd just begun to trust each other with secrets. He had spoken to her just before heading home, promising they'd celebrate once the deal was done. They must have grabbed her right after he left the office, Emily. Mark struggled, his body writhing against the iron grip of the two men. "What have you done to her?" he demanded, his voice cracking with desperation. Lenny burst into laughter, as if Mark had just told the funniest joke in the world. "What have I done?" Lenny howled. "Man, you're a real idiot." The laughter of the others echoed around the room as Mark, exhausted, let his head loll from side to side. He tried to make sense of it all. "Hey, Livy, come tell Marky Boy here what I've been doing to you," Lenny called out, his mocking voice full of glee. Mark's eyes widened as he heard the soft clicking of high heels on the cold floor. He turned his head, and his heart seemed to shatter as Emily came into view. "Hello, Mark," she said, her voice rich and confident, a slight smile playing on her lips. She walked over to Lenny, slipping an arm around his waist and pressing herself against him. Her eyes were as cold as ice. No warmth, no emotion. Emily DeSantis, standing there at 5 feet 8 inches, looked as striking as ever. Her auburn hair shone in the dim light, cut elegantly at shoulder length. She wore an emerald green evening dress, the kind she used to wear to upscale galas, with a pair of white stilettos that clicked on the floor. She looked every bit as glamorous as when they had first met at one of those fundraisers. "Emily?" Mark's voice broke, his face etched with confusion and heartbreak. "Oh, Marky," Lenny chuckled. "For someone who's supposedly smart, you really are a fool." He glanced over at the men holding Mark, a wicked grin stretching across his face. "You had no idea, did you?" Laughter rippled through the room. "This lady you married your business to?" Lenny wrapped his arm tighter around her waist, pulling her closer. "She's been my girl from the start." Mark watched in shock as the two of them kissed in front of him, their lips locking as if he wasn't even there. Disbelief and fury twisted inside of him, his legs nearly giving out, though the thugs held him upright. How could this be happening? "I bet you didn't know, Marky," Lenny jeered, turning his gaze back to Mark, "that I was with her even before she charmed her way into your precious little plan?" He laughed, the sound echoing cruelly off the bare walls. Mark dropped his head, his vision blurring as he stared down at the floor. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to stop the tears of humiliation and anger from escaping. He felt broken. "Ah, look at that Livy," Lenny sneered, nudging her with his elbow. "You made him cry." Emily looked down at Mark, her expression one of complete indifference. "Guess he wasn't as tough as he made himself out to be," she said coldly, her voice devoid of any sympathy. She leaned in closer to Lenny, not sparing Mark another glance. The room filled with the cruel laughter of Lenny and his men, the sound echoing hollowly around them. Mark closed his eyes, his spirit crushed under the weight of their betrayal. She giggled cruelly, and Mark took ragged breaths, his chest heaving as he tried to process the unimaginable betrayal. How had he missed the signs? When he finally opened his eyes, Emily was standing right in front of him, a sneer twisting what had once been a lovely face. This wasn't the Emily he had fallen in love with, the one who had stood by his side through all those late nights and the chaos of market fluctuations. No, this Emily was different, darker, filled with a confidence that held no trace of love or compassion. "Tell him what he wants to know, Marky," she said, her voice cold as she lifted his chin with a manicured fingernail. "It'll go a lot easier for you." Her words were like ice, each one making Mark's gut twist painfully. "You always said you'd do anything for me, right?" she added, her tone suddenly shifting, soft, almost sweet, like the woman he used to know. Her lips curved into a mocking smile. "Don't you want me to be happy, sweetheart?" she whispered seductively. Anger surged through Mark, and he glared at her, catching her off guard just for a moment. But the cold version of her quickly returned, her eyes narrowing. She let go of his chin, reaching down and grabbing him roughly by the groin. Her nails dug into his skin like claws, and Mark cried out, the agony overwhelming him as she twisted and squeezed. "Give us the account numbers," she shrieked, her face twisted with fury. "Give them now." "Whoa, easy there, darling," Lenny laughed, stepping forward and pulling her back. "We're saving his manhood for later, babe." He winked at her as he began unfastening his trousers. "You want to go for his pride? Let's show him what you've got." A wicked gleam lit up Emily's eyes, and she looked back at Mark with a smirk. She knelt down in front of Lenny, making Mark feel even more humiliated. "See this, Mark?" she taunted. "This is what a real man looks like." Mark tried to turn his head, but one of the men holding him grabbed his hair, yanking his head back and forcing him to watch. Nausea rose in his throat as he witnessed the degrading act. Lenny took her right there, in front of Mark, as if he were nothing. Tears streamed down Mark's face, hot and stinging, each drop a symbol of everything he had lost. The love he had once felt for her burned away, consumed in a fiery rage that left only ashes behind. The betrayal was unbearable, but watching her enjoy it twisted the knife even deeper. When Lenny was done, he looked at Mark, grinning. "You like that?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. "Now, let's get back to business." Mark felt his last hope slipping away. His body was broken, his spirit shattered, and the pain barely registered anymore. He tried to retreat into himself, to escape the reality of his situation, but Lenny wasn't finished. The sound of the taser clicking on brought Mark back, his stomach churning. "One last chance, Marky," Lenny said, his voice like ice. "Give me the codes, or you're not going to survive much longer." Mark, exhausted and devastated, choked out the words. "Please, just let her go. Don't hurt her," Lenny sneered. "Oh, Marky, you still don't get it, do you?" He gestured toward Emily, who stood there calm and composed. "She's been in on this from the start. She's not the one suffering, you are." Mark looked at Emily, his heart sinking even lower. She returned his gaze without emotion, her face a mask of indifference. "Tell him, Lenny said, his grin widening. Emily smiled, her expression cold. "It's true, Mark. I never loved you. This was always about the money," she said, her voice devoid of feeling. "Just give him what he wants and make it easier on yourself." Mark felt the last bit of hope crumble within him. Everything he thought he knew was a lie. He was utterly alone. No allies, no love, nothing but emptiness. Lenny leaned in close, his voice a dangerous whisper. "So, what's it gonna be, Mark Grayson?" he asked. Unable to endure anymore, Mark broke. "Fine," he gasped. "I'll give you the codes. Just stop." Lenny's grin returned, wide and wolfish. "Good boy," he said, nodding to the others. They dragged Mark back to a chair, and Emily sat down at the laptop, ready to input the codes. Through gritted teeth, Mark began reciting the account numbers and passwords, each word draining whatever willpower he had left, leaving him an empty husk. When she was done, Lenny checked the screen, his face lighting up with satisfaction. "See? That wasn't so hard, was it?" he sneered. Mark slumped in the chair, barely conscious. His body was in agony, his vision blurred, and his mind was clouded by betrayal and pain. He no longer cared what happened next. "Well, Marky, thanks for cooperating," Lenny mocked, nodding to his thugs. "Hey, Sam, Paulie, finish him off." Mark closed his eyes, welcoming the darkness. He didn't care anymore. Everything he loved was gone. Suddenly, he felt a boot slam into his ribs, pain flaring through his side. This time, though, something felt different. Mark realized, with grim satisfaction, that they had only kept him alive long enough to get what they wanted. He had given them the codes, but something deep inside refused to die, an ember of rage that still burned, flickering stubbornly in the dark. With a last desperate act, Mark lifted his bound hands and struck Lenny in the groin with all the strength he had left. Lenny screamed, stumbling backward, clutching himself. "I won't let you win," Mark muttered, his voice raw, the last ounce of defiance fueling his broken body. Lenny, his face contorted with rage, roared, "You son of a—" He didn't finish. Mark didn't see the boot that slammed into his face, plunging him into darkness for the final time. As he slipped away, fading into the abyss, he felt a strange sense of satisfaction, a tiny, grim victory. Even in the end, Lenny's furious screams echoed in the distance, and Mark allowed himself a final fleeting moment of triumph. "He bit me. Damn it, he bit me," a voice yelled, followed by the brutal impact of a boot slamming into Mark's head. Then there was only silence. Fast-forwarding to the present. It was Friday, October 15th. Monique Thibodeau was a striking woman of mixed heritage, blessed with the best features from her French mother and African-American father. Her defined facial structure, high cheekbones, and dusky gray eyes gave her a captivating allure. Her hair, bleached to a light copper color, was straightened to fall evenly to her shoulders, with step bangs accentuating her thin eyebrows and sharp gaze. Monique typically wore form-fitting leggings and halter tops, but during pool therapy sessions with Mark, she opted for a sleek, revealing one-piece swimsuit. Mark had met Monique shortly after his spinal surgery, and since then, they had spent countless hours together. When she wasn't guiding him through grueling rehabilitation exercises or resistance training, Monique was assisting him with the everyday tasks: dressing, cooking, eating, bathing, and shaving. She was also his massage therapist, working on muscle control and helping him regain the ability to handle routine activities like typing, texting, and using the remote. Mark had developed a mix of admiration and frustration toward her. No matter how angry or rude he got, Monique never lost her upbeat attitude. Her optimism was relentless, and despite his irritation at times, Mark couldn't deny that she was effective. With her help, he was steadily regaining his strength and independence. He also learned that the nanobots they had implanted played a crucial role in his recovery, helping his muscles heal faster and grow leaner. One Saturday evening, Monique came into his room wearing a terry cloth robe, carrying a tray. She smiled at his exhausted expression, laughing lightly. "Don't look so thrilled to see me, Mark," she teased, sitting on the edge of his queen-sized bed. The robe parted at her knees, revealing a glimpse of her long, mahogany-toned legs. "Relax, I'm not here in an official capacity tonight." "Well, not exactly," she added with a playful grin. Mark groaned. "I thought we were done for the day," he muttered. He didn't actually mind her presence, though. In fact, he found himself growing more attached to her as the days went on, despite the exhaustion that constantly weighed on him. "I spoke to Dr. Willoughby earlier," Monique said, setting the tray on the bed. "She mentioned needing a sample." Monique gave him a mischievous smile. "A genetic sample, to be exact." Mark's eyes widened in surprise. "What?" he stammered. Monique smiled coyly. "She wanted you to provide it tomorrow morning, but I convinced her we could collect it sooner." She picked up a small packet from the tray. Mark was speechless as Monique stood up, slowly untying her robe and letting it fall open. His eyes followed her every movement, taking in her flawless body as she sat back on the bed, leaning in to cradle his scarred face with her soft hands. She kissed him, and Mark's mind raced. He had admired her beauty for a while now, but never imagined anything like this. Her touch was gentle yet intense, stirring something within him that he hadn't felt since his injury: desire. Monique took the sample with clinical precision, yet there was undeniable intimacy in her actions. When she finished, she stood up with the tray and began walking toward the door. Mark's eyes remained on her, captivated by the grace of her movements. As she reached the door, it swung open unexpectedly. Dr. Willoughby stepped in, her expression neutral. Without a word, she took the tray from Monique and exited the room. Monique turned back to Mark, smiling. She returned to the bed, her robe still hanging open, and slid beneath the covers beside him. Mark welcomed her embrace, wrapping his arms around her as they kissed again, this time with even deeper passion. When they finally pulled apart, Monique gazed into his eyes. "Now we're free to be as close as we want," she whispered, her words like music to Mark's ears. He had never imagined he could feel warmth or connection again after everything that had happened, but here she was, bringing him back to life. Their relationship deepened, intertwining emotional support with physical recovery. Monique was always by Mark's side, guiding him through even the darkest moments of his journey back to health. At the same time, Mark underwent intense psychological counseling to piece together his fragmented memories and cope with the emotional trauma. As more memories of the violence he had endured began to resurface, nightmares soon followed. No amount of physical therapy or nanobot technology could ease the burden of his mental anguish. But waking up in Monique's arms every morning gave him a small sense of peace that made it all a little more bearable. As Mark's physical recovery progressed, he became something of a fascination among the staff at the Institute. They were eager to test the limits of his body, which led to various challenges: strength tests, endurance trials, and even exposure to extreme conditions. At one point, they put him in a high-tech radiation booth, monitoring as his skin absorbed an unusually high dose of synthetic UV light. His body, enhanced by the nanobots, handled it without a problem, leaving him with nothing more than an impressive tan. Mark wasn't quite an Olympic athlete yet, but the potential he demonstrated was undeniable. However, there remained one area of his rehabilitation that troubled the doctors: his left eye, or rather, its absence. Throughout his recovery, Mark wore an eye patch over a soft orbital prosthetic. Dr. Willoughby, ever the analytical mind, often observed Mark during these trials, her expression one of detached curiosity. She seemed especially intrigued by his eye. She had spoken to him a few times about experimental procedures, mentioning the possibility of integrating advanced prosthetic optics that might give him some form of vision. Mark wasn't sure how he felt about that. The idea of having a mechanical eye unnerved him. But with Monique's support, he began to consider it more seriously. She always encouraged him, urging him to embrace the possibilities. Their nights together were often the only respite he had from the intensity of his rehabilitation. Monique had a way of making the room feel warmer, less sterile, like it wasn't just another part of the facility. She would talk to him about her childhood, her family in New Orleans, and how she had always wanted to work in rehabilitation therapy to make a difference. Slowly, her presence turned into a bright spot, the thing that got him through each grueling day. But the trauma of the past still weighed heavily on him. When the memories of Lenny and Emily surfaced, it felt like a blade had been twisted in his chest. He remembered Emily's cold gaze, her indifference, and the way she had betrayed him so completely. It was Monique who helped him confront those memories, her unwavering support pulling him back from the edge each time the nightmares returned. One night, as they lay in bed, Monique ran her fingers through his hair, her voice soft. "You're stronger than any of them could ever imagine, Mark," she whispered. "You've already survived more than most people ever will. And I'll be here, every step of the way." Mark looked into her eyes and saw something he had thought was gone forever: hope. For the first time since the nightmare began, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a future worth fighting for. "He bit me. Damn it, he bit me," a voice yelled, followed by a vicious blow, a boot crashing down on Mark's head. Then, everything went silent. Back in the present, it was Friday, October 15th. Monique Thibodeau was a stunning woman of mixed descent, embodying the finest features from her French mother and African-American father. Her striking high cheekbones, sharply defined facial structure, and intense, dusky gray eyes made her captivating. Her hair, bleached to a coppery hue, fell straight to her shoulders, styled to frame her face perfectly, with step bangs accentuating her thin, arched eyebrows. Monique typically favored form-fitting leggings and halter tops, but during their pool therapy sessions, she opted for a bold, revealing one-piece swimsuit. Mark met Monique soon after his spinal surgery, and she became an essential part of his journey to recovery. She was there during every physical therapy session, helping him regain strength, endurance, and the ability to perform basic activities. Beyond his rehabilitation workouts, she assisted him with the daily essentials of life: eating, bathing, shaving, and even buttoning his shirts. As his massage therapist, Monique was also focused on helping him recover the fine motor skills needed for everyday tasks like typing, using a phone, and handling a TV remote. Mark's feelings toward Monique were a mix of admiration and frustration. No matter how much he pushed back or how irritable he got, Monique stayed upbeat and cheerful. Her relentless positivity became both a comfort and a point of irritation at times. But he couldn't deny her impact on his progress. Under her guidance, he was regaining strength, independence, and even a bit of hope. The experimental nanobots were a huge factor as well, accelerating his muscle regeneration and improving his overall physical recovery. One Saturday evening, Monique entered Mark's room wearing a soft terry cloth robe, carrying a tray in her hands. She smiled as she took in his tired expression and laughed lightly. "Don't look too excited to see me, Mark," she teased, settling on the edge of his queen-sized bed. The robe parted slightly, revealing her long, toned legs. "Relax, I'm not here for work." "Well, not entirely," she added with a playful grin. Mark groaned softly. "I thought we were done for the day," he mumbled. But despite his exhaustion, he didn't really mind her presence. He felt himself growing more attached to her day by day, even though the weariness of therapy seemed to weigh down every muscle. "I spoke to Dr. Willoughby earlier," Monique said, placing the tray on the bed. "She mentioned needing a sample." Monique's lips curled into a mischievous smile. "A genetic sample, to be exact." Mark's eyes widened in surprise. "What?" he asked, incredulous. Monique smiled coyly. "She wanted you to, provide it tomorrow morning, but I convinced her we could do it tonight instead." She picked up a small packet from the tray. Mark was speechless as Monique slowly untied her robe, letting it fall open. His eyes followed her every move, taking in the sight of her flawless figure. She leaned in, cradling his scarred face with her soft hands, and kissed him gently. Mark's mind spun. He had admired her beauty for a long time, but he had never imagined anything like this. Her touch was gentle, but there was intensity in it, awakening something in him he hadn't felt in what seemed like forever: desire. Monique handled the collection with a clinical precision that could have been cold if it weren't for the closeness she displayed throughout the process. When she finished, she stood up, gathered the tray, and moved toward the door. Mark's eyes followed her graceful movements, captivated. As she reached the door, it unexpectedly swung open. Dr. Willoughby entered, her expression unreadable. She silently took the tray from Monique and left without a word. Monique looked back at Mark, smiling as she turned and walked back to the bed, her robe still hanging open. She crawled under the covers next to him, and Mark welcomed her embrace, wrapping his arms around her as they kissed again, this time with more depth and passion. When they finally pulled apart, Monique looked into his eyes. "Now we're free to be as close as we want," she whispered, her words filling Mark with warmth. He hadn't thought he could feel such connection and comfort again after everything he'd been through, but here she was, pulling him back to life. Their relationship evolved, blending the boundaries between emotional support and physical recovery. Monique was always there, guiding him through even the darkest parts of his journey. At the same time, Mark faced grueling psychological counseling to help him piece together his fragmented memories and confront the trauma he had suffered. The more memories resurfaced, the more he struggled with nightmares that no physical therapy or nanobot technology could alleviate. But waking up beside Monique every morning brought him a small sense of peace, a lifeline that pulled him back from the depths of despair. Mark's physical progress didn't go unnoticed. The staff at the Institute were eager to test the limits of his recovery, subjecting him to increasingly intense tests, strength assessments, endurance trials, and even extreme condition challenges. At one point, they put him into a high-tech booth, simulating intense solar radiation exposure, observing as his skin, enhanced by the nanobots, absorbed the rays with surprising resilience. He emerged from the trial with a remarkable tan and a sense that he was no longer just ordinary. He was something different, something stronger. He wasn't an Olympian yet, but his potential felt limitless. However, there remained one issue that bothered the medical team: his left eye, or rather, its absence. Throughout his rehabilitation, Mark had worn an eye patch covering a soft orbital prosthetic. Dr. Willoughby often discussed experimental options with him, suggesting integrating a cutting-edge prosthetic that might even grant limited vision. Mark wasn't sure. His initial reaction was unease at the thought of a mechanical eye. But with Monique's encouragement, he slowly began to see it as a possibility. She had a way of making him believe in the impossible. Their nights together gave him reprieve from the intensity of his rehabilitation. Monique's presence made the room feel less sterile, less clinical. She would tell him stories of her childhood, growing up in New Orleans, and her passion for rehabilitation therapy. Slowly, she became his anchor, the one who gave him strength to push forward every day, despite the pain and mental toll. But the nightmares still haunted him. Whenever Mark remembered Emily's cold gaze, the way she looked at him without a shred of compassion, the pain twisted deep inside. The betrayal was hard to forget, and it left scars far beyond the physical. It was Monique who pulled him through those memories, who helped him confront them and come out the other side each time he faltered. One night, as they lay together, Monique ran her fingers through his hair, her voice soft and full of empathy. "You're stronger than any of them ever imagined, Mark," she whispered. "You survived what should have destroyed you. And I'm going to be here with you, every step of the way." Mark looked into her eyes and saw something that he had thought was lost forever: hope. For the first time since the nightmare began, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a future worth fighting for. Mark underwent multiple delicate surgeries to reconstruct his optic nerves and rebuild the orbital structure of his left eye. Finally, the day came when he was ready to receive his mechanical eye. He sat in a room full of doctors as they explained the pros and cons. One of them handed him a model, describing in detail how it would connect to the remaining nerve fibers. "This is cutting-edge technology, highly experimental," the doctor explained. "So, I'm a guinea pig?" Mark joked, trying to lighten the mood. "In a way, yes," the doctor replied with a small smile. "But on the bright side, what do you have to lose?" Mark chuckled lightly. "So, with this new eye, I won't be blind anymore, but I won't exactly see either?" "We can't say for sure until after the procedure," the doctor responded. "We expect improved night vision, but there won't be color vision or depth perception from the prosthetic." Mark held up his hands in mock surrender. All right. Spare me the technical details. Let's just do it and see what happens. Where do I sign?" The surgery took place the next day. Mark's face was bandaged as his tissues healed, the nanobots aiding the process. The staff waited anxiously for the results. During his recovery, Dr. Malcolm made occasional appearances. He remained emotionally distant, but he praised Mark's progress. The Institute also provided Mark with access to information about his past life, including the financial dealings that had led to the attack. Mark spent hours on the computer, conducting his own investigation, meticulously tracing the flow of the funds from the corrupted accounts. Despite legal advice to leave it all behind, Mark was resolute. He would have his revenge on those responsible for his suffering. When Mark re-entered society, his facial scars made him unrecognizable to anyone from his previous life. People avoided him, and although the doctors offered to perform plastic surgery, he refused. The scars were a reminder, a badge of his hatred for Emily and Lenny. He wasn't finished with them, not by a long shot. On Friday, December 17th, 2021, Jimmy Sims, better known as Sweet Jimmy, sat at his vanity, putting the final touches on his makeup. He hummed Aretha Franklin's Respect as he puckered his lips at his fabulous reflection in the mirror. With a curly wig and glamorous lashes, he gave a playful twirl before the mirror, reaching for his sequined gown. A knock at the dressing room door interrupted his routine. "Sweet Jimmy ain't ready for visitors," he called out in a sing-song voice, his tone turning sharp as the locked door snapped open. A tall figure stepped in, dressed in worn blue jeans and a hoodie, the hood pulled low over his face. "I won't take much of your time, Jimmy," a deep voice rumbled. Jimmy turned pale, a chill running down his spine. Who? Relax, buddy, the figure said, his voice calm. I'm not here to hurt you. Jimmy cautiously turned back to the mirror, eyeing the man behind him. Zip me up, sugar? He asked, trying to regain his usual flair. Mark snorted, stepping forward to zip up Jimmy's gown. Sweet Jimmy always has time for his biggest fans, Jimmy purred. And you look like one of my biggest. Mark stayed silent, but the tension in the room was palpable. I've got something else in mind, Mark said quietly, his voice low. A favor. Oh, sweet Jimmy loves doing favors, Jimmy said, slipping into his platform stilettos and strapping them on. Come to the club Friday night, and I'll make sure you get what you need. Jimmy blew a kiss at the mirror before touching up his mascara. But why don't you tell me what you're really after, honey? He glanced at Mark's reflection in the mirror. Mark pulled back his hood, revealing the scars that covered his face. Jimmy's eyes went wide, and he turned to face Mark, reaching out to touch the cold, lifeless mechanical eye staring back at him. Oh, baby, Jimmy gasped. Who did this to you? Mark allowed the touch for a moment before stepping back. Let's just say I've got a score to settle, with S and Polly. Jimmy's face blanched at the mention of those names. He knew exactly who they were, and he shook his head, fear in his eyes. Oh no, sweet Jimmy had his run-ins with those two before. No way I'm getting involved again. They like to hurt people. I know, Jimmy, Mark said calmly. All I need is for you to get them outside. Promise them whatever it takes, and I swear they won't hurt you, or anyone else, ever again. Mark pulled a roll of cash from his pocket and tossed it onto the vanity. For your trouble. The parking lot behind the Bearded Clam was dark and unpaved, with cars, trucks, and motorcycles lined along the edges. Only the faint glow of streetlights from the front and side of the building provided any illumination. The back door opened, letting the thumping bass of the club's music spill into the otherwise still night. Jimmy stumbled drunkenly outside, two mob enforcers, S and Polly, close behind him, eager to indulge in Sweet Jimmy's company. Oh, Sweet Jimmy is on fire tonight, they hollered as Jimmy twirled away from them, pulling out a cigarette pack. He held one up seductively and smiled. Either of you boys got a light? He purred. S and Polly followed him to the middle of the lot, growing impatient as Jimmy shrugged and lit his own cigarette. The flicker of the lighter briefly blinded them. Well, a voice said from the shadows, dripping with menace. If it isn't Polly and S. How's it going, boys? Startled, they spun around, squinting at the dark figure stepping out of the shadows. Hey, Polly barked angrily. Who the hell are you? Sneaking up on us like that? Polly clenched his fists, ready to pound on the intruder. Don't you remember me, Polly? Mark said, stepping forward. He pulled back his hood, but the dim light only gave a hint of his scarred face, with a faint glint from his mechanical eye. He grinned at the uneasy mobsters. S tried to circle to Mark's side, hoping to flank him, but Mark's reflexes were sharp. In a flash, he grabbed S by the throat, yanking him forward, and with his other hand, seized Polly by the neck. Their heads collided with a sickening thud, and they crumpled at Mark's feet. Sweet Jimmy's cigarette fell from his lips, the pretense of his feminine persona dropping entirely. Holy crap, dude, he exclaimed, wide-eyed. Who the hell are you? Don't worry about it, Jimmy, Mark said calmly. Just head back inside and forget this ever happened. Okay. Jimmy nodded vigorously, his eyes wide with fear, before scurrying back into the bar. Polly woke up groggily, the scent of fresh ocean air and the sounds of squawking seagulls disorienting him. He struggled to make sense of where he was. He found himself sitting on a cold wooden beam, his bare feet dangling into seawater. Across from him sat S, facing him in the same position. Polly could feel the sharp sting of barnacles against his back, realizing he was tied to a piling behind him. His hands were bound in front of him, and his mouth was gagged. Panic set in when he looked down between his legs and saw the horror. His most sensitive part was nailed to the beam beneath him, a large spike driven through it. S was in the same predicament across from him. As soon as Polly became aware of the pain, it surged through him, growing worse as he tried to move. A lazy wave splashed against the pilings, spraying his face and chest. S groaned as the reality of their situation sank in, and he began to scream through his gag. "Good morning, boys." Mark greeted them warmly as he stepped into view. The water reached his hips as he waded closer. "I wasn't sure you'd wake up at all. Thought you might drown on me," he said, chuckling. The two men stared at him in terror, unable to recognize the scarred face and mechanical eye that looked down at them with twisted amusement. "You don't recognize your own handiwork?" Mark asked. "Tell me, how's Lenny doing after I tried to bite him off?" He looked between them as sudden recognition began to dawn on their faces. The horror on their expressions deepened. "Well, I guess you can't tell me much with those gags on." Mark laughed, holding up an old, green wine bottle encrusted with barnacles, clearly fished from the sea. "Don't you just hate littering, especially when we can reuse so many things?" He gestured around at the barnacle-covered pilings. "Take this bottle, for instance," he said, swinging it over S's head. S flinched as the bottle shattered against the piling behind him, raining shards of glass into his lap. "Now, this bottle can be used to cut," Mark announced, gripping a shard of glass in his hand. "Let me show you." S whimpered as Mark clumsily sawed through the rope, tying his chest to the piling, nicking his skin several times in the process. The rope eventually fell away. "Careful now," Mark warned. "Don't fall off that beam and end up hanging by that nail." S's eyes went wide as another wave came in, the water splashing higher around them. He clung to the beam desperately. Mark turned to Polly, starting to saw through his rope. "Dang, the tide's coming in faster than I thought," he muttered as he cut through Polly's rope, letting it drop. Now only a thin twine held their hands together, leaving them vulnerable as the water continued to rise. Mark stepped back, pointing the broken bottle at their tied-down limbs. "You've got a choice," he said, his voice firm. The two men stared back at him, eyes wide with terror. "Cut yourselves loose or drown." He nodded toward their wrists. "I've bled a lot lately, and I've learned a few things," he added with a grin, like he was sharing a secret. "It's easy to bleed out, so you've got to be careful." Another wave came in, nearly reaching the beam. "That string around your wrists makes a perfect tourniquet," he said, glancing at them. "You know what a tourniquet is, right?" They stared back, terrified. "It's French for tight band, or something like that. Anyway, you tie it tight below where you're cutting so you won't bleed to death when you free yourselves." His grin turned sinister. "See? No exsanguination. Cool word. Huh? Not French, it's Latin. Means bloodless." The water was rising faster, and Mark's voice took on a casual tone. "In a few minutes, the tide will be over your heads, so move quickly." He eyed the shard of glass in his hand. "Sorry, I only found one piece, so you'll have to share." A larger wave hit, nearly knocking them into the water. Mark steadied them for a moment, and they looked at him with a strange gratitude. "I could just leave the glass here," he mused, "but it might wash away." He paused, calculating. "How about this? I'll give it to the first one who tells me where Lenny and Emily are." The men exchanged desperate, panicked glances. "Don't take too long," Mark warned, his voice calm but menacing. "Time's ticking." Later that evening, a sleek, black Lincoln Continental glided through the city streets, entering a private garage that descended into the executive parking area. The car stopped by the elevators, and the driver opened the door for Lenny, who then helped Emily out. Arm in arm, they made their way to the elevator, and Lenny pressed the button for his penthouse. Unexpectedly, the elevator stopped on the 5th floor, and a large man in a hoodie and sunglasses stepped inside. Lenny glared at the intruder. "This is a private elevator," he snapped. "Use the public one." The man silently held up a black access card, sliding it into the VIP slot before pressing a button for a lower floor. The doors closed again. "You've got a lot of nerve, pal," Lenny growled, reaching to grab the guy's shoulder. Lenny didn't expect the man to spin around and press metal electrodes directly against his throat. The taser clicked repeatedly, and Lenny convulsed before collapsing onto the floor, his body twitching uncontrollably. Emily screamed, frozen in horror as the stranger loomed over her. He pulled back his hood. "Hi, sweetheart," Mark said cheerfully, taking off his sunglasses. "Miss me?" He paused for a few seconds, giving her time to absorb the shock of his scarred face and artificial eye before zapping her as well. Emily crumpled next to Lenny. Mark turned to the control panel, pulling out a fire access key. He rerouted the elevator to the emergency vehicle deployment area on the first basement level. Lenny woke up to the sharp sting of repeated slaps across his face. "Hey, Lenny, wake up. Time to face the music," Mark shouted, leaning over his crumpled body. Lenny shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts, and realized he was bound hand and foot. He was lying on the floor of a small compartment that was moving. The realization dawned on him. He was also completely naked and shivering from the cold. "What the—" Lenny mumbled, looking up. His eyes widened in shock as he took in the sight of the disfigured figure standing over him. "Don't you remember me?" Mark asked with mock cheerfulness. "We were really close just a few months ago." A muffled whimper came from behind, and Lenny felt another body pressed up against his back. "Ellie, baby," Lenny muttered, stunned. Mark's grin widened. "Oh, isn't love grand?" he said, lifting Lenny by the face and forcing him to sit up against the bulkhead. Now Lenny could see Emily. She was bound like him, curled into a fetal position on the cold deck, sobbing at his feet. "Come on, Ellie," Mark chided. "Don't be a downer. Tell him." Emily looked up, her eyes swollen from crying, her gaze fixed on Mark's mangled face. "Please, Mark," she whispered, barely audible through her sobs. "Johnny," Lenny muttered in disbelief. "Is that you?" His voice cracked. "Polly and S, they said you were dead. They said they fed you to the sharks." Mark smiled, shaking his head. "Oh, Lenny," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "They botched it. I accidentally fell out of the car before they could dump me. They couldn't come back for me afterward." He spread his arms wide, mocking them. "So, they lied to you. You can't get good help these days." The deck beneath them shifted, swaying slightly. Mark turned away and climbed a small ladder, pulling down a duffel bag that was strapped above. He rummaged through it, pulling out 2 brick-sized packages wrapped in dark plastic. He pressed them to the bulkhead above Lenny and Emily's heads, activating them. Red lights began flashing. "What the hell are you doing?" Lenny's voice rose in panic. "Well, Lenny," Mark said pleasantly, as if they were having a casual conversation, "I'm a bit pissed off. After everything you put me through, you didn't even have the decency to make sure I was dead." He smiled at Lenny, who stared at him, wide-eyed and terrified. "Payback's a real pain, huh?" He gestured around them. "We're currently drifting off the Outer Banks on this little cruiser. Nobody's gonna miss this boat." Mark pulled out 2 cinder blocks from the duffel bag, setting one next to each of them. He used lengths of rope to tie a block to each of their feet. "I've placed shaped charges around the hull," he explained, his voice calm. "Once I detonate them, the bottom of this boat will fall out, and you two will go right down with it." He was smiling, clearly savoring their terror. "Did you know that great hammerhead sharks migrate through here? I'm sure they're hungry." Emily and Lenny screamed, their terrified cries echoing around the small cabin. Mark ignored them, focusing instead on climbing back up the ladder to the hatch. He exited, leaving them to their fate. Once on deck, he looked around into the vast darkness, nothing but the empty ocean in every direction. Even with his enhanced optical eye, all he saw was water. He moved to the side of the boat, climbed over the edge, and dropped nimbly into a gray Zodiac inflatable raft that was tethered beside the yacht. After casting off, he pulled the starter cord on the outboard motor, which roared to life. He cruised slowly away from the vessel. Reaching into his pocket, Mark pulled out a remote trigger. Without hesitation, he flipped the switch. The thud of the explosions reverberated through his small raft, vibrating under his feet. If he had looked back, he would have seen the yacht shudder before it sank beneath the waves, disappearing in seconds without a trace. The trip back to shore would take nearly 2 hours, and Mark smiled into the darkness, thinking about the future. A burden had been lifted from his soul, and for the first time in years, he felt hopeful. Monique had left several magazines scattered around his room, magazines featuring celebrities and male models with chiseled cheekbones and piercing eyes. Mark's artificial eye could be modified to match his natural one, or so the experts had assured him. He sighed as the sea spray hit his face. Perhaps he could put up with the Institute's endless probing and testing for a while longer. They had been instrumental in helping him achieve his revenge, and he supposed he owed them that much.